Thank you for accessing Vocabulary Module 3, Word Learning Strategies. This module is the last of 3 in a vocabulary tutorial series developed for the Teacher Collaboration Project between Rio Rancho Public Schools and the Southwest English Learners Partnership, a partnership within the Regional Educational Laboratory, or REL Southwest, a part of the National Center for Educational Evaluation and Regional Assistance within the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. If this is not the first module that you've viewed in this tutorial, you can scrub ahead in the recording until you see a slide with a large purple star in the upper right-hand corner, which signals the start of new content. The content up until that slide is common to all 3 modules. The focus of this tutorial and the focus of our partnership as a whole is on supporting EL students' achievement. And for that, we look to the kinds of practices in instruction that are best supported by rigorous research. The latest What Works Clearinghouse EL-focused practice guide, which was published in 2014, endorses academic vocabulary instruction as a very promising and strongly supported practice that comes from research and that we know works for cultivating EL's content knowledge and literacy skills. Together, there are 2 recommendations that are presented in this practice guide that are supported by strong evidence. And those recommendations emphasize 2 things. 1, integrating a variety of academic vocabulary instructional activities, and 2, doing so into content area teaching. So you can see the recommendations as articulated in that practice guide here focus on 1, teaching a set of academic vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities, and 2, integrating oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. These may seem simple, but there's a lot packed into these 2 recommendations. The What Works Clearinghouse practice guides break their recommendations down into concrete implementation steps that you can actually bring to bear in your instruction. Each of our 2 recommendations that are the focus of this vocabulary tutorial include 4 concrete implementation steps that we'll go into different levels of detail on as we progress through the different tutorial modules. For recommendation 1, which reads, teach a set of academic vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities, we have a focus on choosing a brief, engaging piece of informational text that includes academic vocabulary, choosing a small set of academic vocabulary for in-depth instruction, teaching academic vocabulary in depth using multiple modalities, including writing, speaking, and listening, and teaching word learning strategies to help students independently figure out the meaning of words. Those 4 implementation steps will give us the overarching structure of our 3 vocabulary tutorial modules, as I'll discuss on the next slide. But I wanted to draw your attention to the way that recommendation 2 is also spelled out in 4 implementation steps, which will be infused throughout the instruction that we offer here. The first implementation step for recommendation 2, which again is about integrating oral and written language instruction into content area teaching, talks about strategically using instructional tools like videos, visuals, and graphic organizers to anchor instruction and help students make sense of content, explicitly teaching the content-specific academic vocabulary as well as general academic vocabulary that supports it during content area instruction. The third implementation step talks about providing daily opportunities for students to talk about content in pairs or small groups. So this is oral language practice emphasis. And then provide writing opportunities to extend student learning and understanding of the content material. So as just mentioned, the 4 implementation steps that are contained in this recommendation 1 give us the structure of the 3 modules for this vocabulary tutorial. And we can extract from those 4 implementation steps these 3 different focuses that we'll go into in some depth over the course of the 3 modules. The first is about selecting text and target words, both the selection activities that have some similar characteristics. The second is providing in-depth multimodal instruction. And the third is teaching word learning strategies. You can also watch a member of the panel that put together the What Works Clearinghouse practice guide and see her describe recommendation 1 on YouTube, which is linked here, but there's also a clickable link on our resources website. So in this module, we're focusing on how to teach word learning strategies that can help students independently figure out the meaning of words. And this approach is really meant to complement the in-depth multimodal instruction that may occupy a lot of your thinking and co-planning as you're considering how to take academic vocabulary and bring it across modalities into your classroom. And the goal here should really be to strike an intentional balance between the approaches, with direct instruction on the one hand and word learning strategies on the other. The way to start that is to think about when to use each type of instruction. So direct instruction makes sense during teacher-led activities throughout a lesson, and oftentimes word characteristics will dictate whether extended or more embedded direct instruction is appropriate. On the other hand, word learning strategies can be utilized by students all throughout the course of a lesson, including during small group work or pair work, and they can use those strategies for individual work in class or at home as well. And then when we think about the target words that we selected and which kind of instructional approach to use, some of the best suited words for direct instruction are words that may be hard to read or pronounce, words that represent more abstract concepts, and words that are critical to understanding a target text, which are features that you may recall from the first module about selecting words to teach within a new target text. Word learning strategies, on the other hand, tend to be more effective with words that have homonyms or homophones, words that have home language cognates, and words that appear in multiple lesson texts that can offer contextual clues. So if you need a refresher on the direct instruction suited words, then I would advise you to go back to Module 2. Today's focus will be on word learning strategies and how best to teach those words and help students teach themselves those words that are suited to these strategies. There really is a wide range of possibilities for student-guided activities that help them learn words. When they're feeling less confident in their understanding of a word, students can do things like look at their glossary for different kinds of anchors and examples and definitions and depictions. They can search for context clues in the surrounding sentence and paragraph, as well as accompanying images and graphics. They can posit a cognate in their home language and then consider whether that meaning makes sense in the text they're reading. They can break a word down into its morphological constituents, into its root and its affixes, to reveal the word's part of speech and its relationship to shorter or more familiar words, and so on. And they can also consult a variety of dictionaries and online resources and apps that can support their word mastery as well. So we have sort of 3 key options to the kinds of student-guided activities that you can foster in your own classroom and in collaborations between yourselves as educators. On the far left here, we have dictionaries and digital resources, including dictionary websites and lots of different smartphone apps that help students quickly look up and make meaning out of what might be unfamiliar words. The center bar here refers to Glossary Use, which we discussed as the sort of object or scaffold for direct instruction, but it can also be extremely useful as a word learning strategy for students to apply and practice recalling and elaborating their understanding of new words. And then in the shortest bar, we have kind of a hodgepodge of all of the other features that you can consider trying to cultivate in your students with the strategies that we'll discuss, including cognates, helping them look for context clues, thinking about roots and affixes, and more. So when we focus on glossaries in the context of word learning strategies, there are a few key things to keep in mind. One is just to remind students to keep their glossaries available. There's such rich information in these, and they can become accustomed to relying on them if that information is there and ready at hand as they're reading new texts on a similar topic, or working through texts on their own that may not be related but may include your target words. You should especially encourage students to annotate their glossaries. These are supposed to be living documents, so they can do things like mark down word variants as they come across them, either in conversation with their classmates or in reading. You can have them write down translation equivalents, whether they're cognates or not. Just having that extra reminder of a familiar gloss of a word can be extremely helpful in fostering students' confidence in their mastery of their new word. You can also encourage students to annotate these glossaries with word parts, so breaking down words into their roots and affixes, helping them to see relationships across words that might be more productive as they gain more academic vocabulary mastery. And then synonyms kind of serve the function of quick offhand definitions, and a similar thing to translation equivalents where they are an immediate reflection of more familiar words that mean approximately the same thing as the target word, helping sort of build out students' cognitive word networks as they understand how words and concepts relate to one another. And kind of building on that, the third recommendation here is to include space to draw out connections. So even though it doesn't seem immediately that impact and bombard and transmit are related in some kind of semantic deep meaning sense, you could imagine how impact and bombard often come together in texts that might be about some kind of difficult situation that involves some aggression on the part of a nation state or something like this, where there are connections that you might draw and that students might draw across their vocabulary words, and not just with a single lesson's glossary, but across the glossaries that they develop for your different lessons and units. And then sometimes it can be especially helpful as you're fostering a lot of new vocabulary over time to use electronic resources if you can. And that will help with easily searching these relationships that we're saying might exist between the words that you're teaching. And even though that might make it more difficult to keep glossaries at hand in one sense, in another sense, to have a comprehensive record of the words and the depth of understanding that is developed around them that you're teaching can be really valuable to students. Another thing to focus on in word learning strategies for ELs is cognates. So you can help students both detect and interpret cognates during read-alouds and also while they're reading on their own. So there are these activities that I've mentioned a couple of times that can be used to practice, including a word sort activity in which you would create index cards with cognates and then have students find and match those cognates, matching family with familia, car with carro. And even though there may be some similarities across languages between words, finding the closest match and noticing how the sounds and spellings and meanings are similar can help students start to recognize those relationships on their own. But another thing that cognates can help us do is develop what we call metalinguistic awareness, so awareness of language as an object, so something that you can inspect and manipulate. And cognates have these interesting characteristics that draw those skills out. One thing you can do is this catch the differences game, where you present cognates that have some letter differences and then have students circle them. So immigrant is spelled I-M-M-I, but the Spanish version, inmigrante, is I-N-M-I. That's a systematic difference that you see across Spanish and English translation equivalents that are cognates, and then you can discuss why that might be and start drawing students' attention to these characteristics so that they can then go back and predict, if they might, what the English translation of a Spanish word that they already know is. Cognates are not everywhere, however, and there's another category of words that we think about in relation to cognates called false friends, which are words that sound like they should be cognates. They have a similar sound pattern across languages, but they don't actually mean the same thing. And when you play this game, you can ask students to identify false cognates and then ask whether they share any aspects of meaning. So the few that we've listed here are globe and global, which means balloon. Exit in English does not mean much in common with éxito, success in Spanish. But if you think about it, there may be some relationships there, some deep semantic features that they share. And these kinds of reflections can help ELs focus on the things that they know and the resources that their home language allows them to cultivate and bring to the classroom, and that they can teach their English-speaking and non-linguistically diverse peers to start recognizing as well, because we know that this is a valuable skill in longer-term academic achievement for things like SATs, where having more familiarity with different Latinate roots, which are in common with Romance languages like Spanish and Portuguese, can help with success on parsing and interpreting unfamiliar complex words that are related to more familiar, simpler ones that have these continued existences in Romance languages in modern language. Now, the final one of these games is called Don't Stress Out. So it also is meant to foster metalinguistic awareness by drawing attention to cognates that have different stress and intonation and accent patterns. So animal and animal are spelled exactly the same way in English and Spanish, but as you heard, animal, animal, the stress patterns are different, and these kinds of differences are also in many ways systematic, and it helps students recognize that there are different kinds of pronunciations they should aim for and practice with, and building those skills around recognizing similarities and differences within and across languages can only help them master new words in the context of new texts and new content. Speaking of contexts, we also want to help students focus on contextual language. So beyond these glossary and cognate resources, you can encourage students to explore the textual context for clues to meanings. And this works well when words are repeated multiple times in texts, in target texts, which is something we emphasized in the first module, but also when texts are rich in content. Students are much better able to make use of that context and assign a reasonable meaning to a word that they can then continue to use. You can also help students focus on word parts. So we mentioned in the context of cognates that students can start to develop this metalinguistic skill in recognizing characteristics of language as an object and how you can break it apart and manipulate it and make it do what you want it to do. Well, helping students see the parts of words that are clues to their meaning strengthens their ability to make sense of new words that they come across. Because the words might be new, but the parts will be familiar and therefore meaningful, which can be extremely helpful in expectations of mastery of new words and content where there is already a foundation of some affix knowledge, whether it be adjective markers like the ul or int suffix that you see here, the adverb marker li, and being able to recognize these characteristics gives students a leg up as they're making sense of these new words. So here's a target text, another sample text in approximately the upper elementary grade range, where there are a few words. We have this glossary. We've selected these 3 words that would be target words for a 4th grade class in history. And we have immigrant, forbidden, and citizen. And then we, in this glossary, have the 3 of the features that we've discussed previously: definition, cognates, and then a wordplay activity, which students can sort of dive into. And I encourage you, if you're curious about this yourself, to pause the recording here for a moment and just dig into those entries there, because the wordplay ones are quite a bit of fun and can inspire sort of out-of-the-box thinking about what to do with words that seem like they're morphologically complex, so that seem like they have roots and affixes, but they don't have a good correspondence on their face to anything that you might happen to know in another familiar language. So we have that glossary on the one hand, and then we want to take an opportunity to think about this text as if you were an EL or as if you were not an EL. So as I mentioned a few slides back, it's useful to think about these activities that foster metalinguistic awareness, especially drawing attention to cognates, but other things as well, as opportunities for your ELs to showcase their strengths in understanding things about language that are also useful to your English monolingual students. So take a few moments, pause the recording again, and take a look at how many cognates you think are in this passage and how many false friends. You won't be able to identify false friends unless you are a speaker of another language that might have cognates here, but if you're not a speaker of, say, Spanish or Portuguese, you still may be able to identify some of the words that you would expect to be cognates based on the fact that they have Latin origins. That is to say, cognates with Spanish or Portuguese, for example. You might be able to find cognates with other languages as well. So in our investigation of this text, our parsing of this text, we found a number of different cognates. It seems like we've got 7. Part, family, immigrant, school, gentle, father, and English all have very similar translation equivalents in Spanish. They have similar sounds, they have similar spellings, even though in some cases the spellings are a little bit different. And these are, again, things that you can discuss and explore with your students, because what you really want to do is just get them thinking and talking about language and words. It helps draw their attention to the novelty of words and the different things that they can do with them. There is a false friend in here, though. So if you were to do the traditional translation, just taking a guess of what parent would sound like in its Spanish version, you might end up saying pariente. But pariente does not mean parent. It's a more generic term. It refers to relatives as a larger group. And so you can then help students see you can't just guess across languages. There are constraints on what words that sound a certain way mean, and those constraints have a historical basis, and language is maintained in a cultural context. And so these things are all sort of lessons about language that you can embed in any content area, because whenever you're working with text or working with language, and inspiring students to think about these things and be interested in these kinds of issues and questions can only help them be more curious about reading around, learning from different genres, and making the most of the language that they're learning in school. So our key takeaways from this 3rd module in our tutorial are, again, based in the 2 different approaches to teaching vocabulary. We had the direct instructional approach, but this word learning strategies approach is really a strong complement to that, in that it gives students some of the tools to build their own word stores, their own vocabulary knowledge, and deepen their understanding of vocabulary, which might be new, in virtue of learning how to reflect on new words and what they might mean in the context that they're encountered in. So the particular takeaways here are a few reminders of what you can do, to what kinds of word learning strategies you can foster, including creating and using glossaries with varied types of entries, helping students detect and interpret cognates, encouraging students to explore the textual content for clues to meanings, and remembering in a general way that ELs benefit from effective word teaching techniques that are applicable to the whole class. Not only that, but the specific EL word teaching techniques can be helpful to the whole class as well in a different way. And so we encourage you to take these techniques into your collaborations and into your classrooms and to try them out. And if you need more information, as always, you can check out the key resource that this presentation draws on, the 2014 What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide. You can also look at parts 1 and 2 of this vocabulary tutorial at our project website, and other resources, including materials and guides that you can draw from in your collaboration teams. And with that, we thank you very much for your continued collaboration with us and look forward to keeping on working with you. Thank you.